Why do some people radiate peace, even after everything falls apart? And why do others, despite having all they need, still feel lost inside? To understand this is to begin walking the path to true strength. As the Zen master Ryokan once wrote, "The thief left it behind, the moon at my window." Welcome, dear friend, to Mindful Footsteps. This is not just a channel. This is a quiet place to remember who you are beneath the noise. A space to sit with the questions your soul has been whispering for years. If you're ready to slow down, to walk not faster, but deeper, then stay a while. If you feel resonance in what you hear, like this video, share it with someone walking their own inner path, and subscribe to join this growing circle of stillness seekers. We begin not by striving, but by breathing. Chapter 1. Suffering is a teacher, not an enemy. There is suffering. It sounds like the beginning of a sad story, but in truth, it's the beginning of awakening. Suffering is not a punishment. It is not a sign that life has gone wrong. It is a doorway. Now pause with me for a moment and ask yourself, when was the last time you let your pain speak? Not to fix it, not to bury it, but simply to listen. What if pain was trying to teach you something? In the early chapters of life, we're taught to outrun pain. We're told, if you fall, get up. If your heart breaks, move on. If something hurts, hide it. But what if the wound is the place where light can enter? What if the ache in your chest, the tension in your jaw, the heaviness behind your eyes isn't just weakness, but wisdom trying to get through? I remember a conversation I had with a young man who had lost everything in a divorce: his family, his home, even his sense of identity. He looked at me and asked, "Why do I feel like I've failed at being human?" I looked into his eyes and asked gently, "What if this pain is your teacher? What if you haven't failed, but begun?" In Buddhism, we begin with what most of the world tries to avoid: dukkha, the truth that life contains suffering. But this isn't hopelessness, it's clarity. The Buddha didn't stop there. He said, yes, there is suffering, but there is also a cause, and there is also an end. And the path toward that end, it starts not by running from pain, but by turning toward it with compassion. The Buddha told the story of the two arrows. Imagine this. You're walking through the forest, and an arrow strikes you. It hurts, it's sharp, you bleed. That is pain. That is life. But then what do? We fire a second arrow into ourselves. We say, I shouldn't feel this way. This always happens to me. Why can't I be stronger? We replay the memory. We blame. We tighten. The second arrow is our resistance, and often it's more painful than the first. I once met a rice farmer in Cambodia whose entire crop was destroyed in a flood. His buffalo drowned. His food was gone. And when I visited him, I expected bitterness, but instead, he welcomed me with tea and said, "I know grief, but I will not hate the river." I was silent, humbled. He explained, "The river gives and the river takes. That is its nature. It is not cruel. It simply is." That is wisdom. To feel the pain, but not turn it into poison. To grieve, but not become the grief. Can you imagine what your life might feel like if you let pain pass through you without holding it hostage? Let me tell you a truth I rarely share. I became a monk before I truly understood suffering. I had studied the texts, practiced meditation, chanted every morning, but it wasn't until I lost my mother that those teachings came alive and pierced me. I didn't chant that night. I didn't light incense. I simply walked barefoot into the monastery garden, sat beneath the Bodhi tree, and cried. not like a monk, but like a son. People expected me to be composed, but peace does not mean absence of sorrow. Peace means allowing sorrow to move through you without resistance. That night, my tears weren't a weakness. They were my teachers. Each one whispered, "This is love. This is impermanence. This is what it means to be fully human." Let me ask you, what pain are you still resisting? What memory are you still carrying like a stone in your chest? And what would it feel like if you simply let it sit beside you without judgment? Would you be willing to place a cushion next to your sorrow and say, "You may sit here, you may stay for now. I do not fear you"? You might wonder, this is easy for monks. But what about the real world? What about people who have to lead, decide, act? Let me remind you, no one escapes the truth of suffering. Not kings, not presidents, not billionaires. Barack Obama once shared that during his presidency, in moments of deep personal stress, he would pause, breathe, and return to his breath. He said, "You don't have time for drama when you're trying to hold the weight of a country." Even Oprah Winfrey spoke about sitting in stillness every morning before any meeting to remind herself, this is not just business, this is energy. So if they can pause, feel, and listen to their suffering, why can't we? You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to heal overnight. You don't have to understand all your wounds right now. You only have to sit with them. The next time sadness shows up at your door, don't slam it shut. Don't drown it in noise. Don't scroll it away. Light a candle, pour some tea, and ask it, "What are you here to show me?" Let me ask you, what has suffering taught you about yourself? Is there a story you've been carrying that you're ready to honor and release? Share it in the comments. You don't have to give details. Just say, "I'm sitting with it." Let us witness you. Because sometimes being seen is the first step to healing. Remember, suffering is not the end. It's the beginning of a deeper relationship with life. The goal is not to be unshaken. The goal is to be present while the earth moves beneath your feet. So next time you feel the arrow, pause, breathe. Don't shoot the second one, and let it hurt. Let it teach. Let it pass. Then, gently, come home to yourself again. Chapter 2. The calm mind is stronger than the storm. The sea does not fight the storm. It simply sinks beneath it. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. We live in a world that teaches us to fight. Fight for your place. Fight for your success. Fight for your voice to be heard. But the teachings of the Dharma invite something different. Not to retreat, not to run, but to be still. Not frozen, but rooted. Not passive, but deeply present. In the monastery, we are taught to sit like a mountain, not because we want to resist the wind, but because we know the wind will pass. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you stopped trying to change the storm, and instead, just let yourself breathe through it? A hurricane in the heart. When I was in my 40s, I was sent to a remote temple on a mist-covered mountain in northern Laos. The winters were cruel. The food was scarce. The villagers, gentle souls, were generous but poor. We had no electricity. At night, the mountain was cloaked in thick silence, except one night. That night, the silence was broken by footsteps, by fear, by thieves. They came not for violence, but for rice, for survival. I heard them outside. I knew what was happening, but instead of reaching for a stick or raising my voice, I walked into the temple hall, lit a single candle, and sat in meditation, not in defense, but in presence. I closed my eyes and simply breathed. And when they entered, they stopped. Not because I fought them, but because they saw a man who did not fear them. Stillness, not shouting, stopped the storm. It is easy to fight when you're afraid. It is powerful to stay rooted in peace. So I ask you, what would it feel like if the next time your life shook, you didn't try to fight, but chose to be still? Stillness is not silence. There's a common misunderstanding that being still means doing nothing, that it's avoidance, weakness, passivity. But stillness is none of those things. Stillness is clarity. Stillness is the decision to stay present, even when your instincts scream to flee. Stillness is courage, refined. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor. What he meant was, the storm doesn't stop, but you can stop being pulled by it. You can train your breath to become your compass. You can learn to anchor your awareness, even in the center of pain. Have you tried this before? The next time someone says something that angers you, what if you didn't respond right away? What if you took one conscious breath, then another, and then asked yourself, what am I really feeling? What part of me is afraid? You may be surprised at how much power exists inside just pausing. What happens when you sit with the storm? There's a story I often tell. It's about Raymond. He was in his 70s when he lost his wife. They had been married for 43 years. She passed quietly in the early morning while he was still asleep. Raymond came to the monastery not looking for religion, but for a place where his tears would not feel like a burden. He could not meditate. He told me, every time I close my eyes, she's there, and then she's gone again. I did not offer him any mantras. I simply gave him a small cushion and said, sit with her. Every morning, he returned. 3 minutes turned into 5, 5 into 10. And somewhere in the space between breath and memory, he found not escape, but sacred witnessing. He once told me, grief is no longer a crashing wave. It's a tide. It rises. It falls. And sometimes, it leaves shells of wisdom on the shore. Stillness did not erase his pain, but it transformed how he related to it. And that is the secret. You don't need to stop the rain. You just need to stop getting drenched by it every time. What is meditation, really? Meditation is not a retreat. It is a return to your center, a return to the breath, a return to the present moment, where life actually happens. You don't need to light incense. You don't need to chant. You don't need to shave your head or fold your legs into a lotus. You can sit in your kitchen, on your porch, on the edge of your bed, close your eyes, and just listen to your breath, to your body, to the silence between your thoughts. That is enough. When you do that often enough, even for just 5 minutes a day, your nervous system learns that it can trust you. Your mind begins to soften its grip. Your emotions begin to move like wind, not stone. So I invite you now to reflect. When life is overwhelming, what do you reach for first? Is it the phone, the fridge, the TV remote, the bottle? What if you reach for the breath instead? What if stillness became your default? The more you practice calm in ordinary moments, the more naturally it arises in difficult ones. Like a path in the forest. The more you walk it, the clearer it becomes. And when you're lost, you'll know the way back. When you're in traffic and someone cuts you off, pause, breathe, don't curse, smile instead. Not for them, but for yourself. When the news overwhelms you or someone's anger shakes you, close your eyes, touch your breath, return to your center. This is not inaction. This is intentional presence. And over time, this presence becomes power. Power that doesn't shout. Power that doesn't need to control. Power that simply is. A question for you right now in your own life. What is the storm you're facing? Is it a diagnosis, a fractured relationship, an uncertain future, a silent grief? I ask you this not to trigger pain, but to invite you to practice something radical. Instead of resisting the storm, can you sit with it? Can you allow yourself to feel without drowning? To breathe without fixing? If yes, just say in the comments, I'm learning to sit with it. That's all. Let others know they're not alone. Let your presence be a light for someone else's darkness. Remember this. The storm is not personal. The waves are not punishing you. They are teaching you how to stand, not by fighting the sea, but by becoming the shore, still, unmoving, enduring. And that, my dear friend, is where true strength begins. Chapter 3. Discipline is a gentle form of love. Discipline is not control. It is remembering what matters. There's a certain misunderstanding in the world today. That discipline must be rigid, that it means rules, pressure, perfection. But in the monastery, we see it differently. Discipline is rhythm. It is grace in motion. It is how we return, again and again, not out of force but out of care. Think of the ocean. It does not crash against the shore in anger. It ebbs and flows every day, without fail. Not because it's told to, but because that is its nature. And so it is with a life well lived. Discipline is not what we do to impress the world. It is how we keep promises to ourselves when no one is watching. Let me ask you, what is the smallest ritual you do every day, not because you have to, but because your soul asks for it? The morning candle. Every morning at 4 a.m., I wake before the sun. The monastery is silent. Even the birds have not begun their chanting. I walk barefoot across the cool stone floor and light a single candle. I do not light it to honor a god. I do not light it because someone told me I must. I light it to remember. To remember light exists, even before the world has proof. To remember that clarity comes slowly. That healing, like dawn, does not rush. That candle becomes my anchor. Its flame reminds me, even in darkness, something steady still burns. That is what discipline is. It is a flame that does not ask for applause. It just shows up, every morning, faithfully, quietly. What is your candle? Is it journaling? Walking the dog at the same time each day? Boiling your tea slowly and drinking it in silence before anyone else wakes? Your ritual does not need to be profound. It only needs to be present. Rhythm over rigidity. People think monks live strict lives, that we live by clocks and commands. But in truth, monastic life is not about restriction. It's about rhythm. We bow not because we must. We bow because it reminds us we are not the center of the universe. We walk slowly, not because we're lazy, but because each step is a miracle. We eat in silence not to avoid conversation, but to hear our food speak through gratitude. Discipline is a pattern of care. It is the gentle act of realigning yourself with your deeper self, day after day. Ask yourself, what routines in your life feel like acts of love rather than obligation? If none come to mind, then you haven't found your rhythm yet, and that's okay. Start small. Water a plant at the same time each morning. Make your bed while humming. Stretch your arms to the sky and whisper, "Thank you," when you rise. That is spiritual discipline. That is devotion. A gentle anchor in chaotic times. You may say, "But my life is too chaotic for discipline. I have too much going on." I say to you, that is exactly why you need it. The world pulls you in 1,000 directions: family, work, news, notifications. Discipline becomes your sacred thread. It ties you back to your center. Without it, your days blur. Time passes, and you forget who you are becoming. But with it, even in the middle of chaos, you can find your breath again. Like a lighthouse on the cliff, your simple practice calls you home. The school teacher and her tea. There was a woman named Helen. She was a retired school teacher who lived near our monastery. She had raised children, taught for decades, and outlived her husband. At 82, she lived alone. But she was not lonely. Every morning she would rise at 6:30, wash her face in cold water, light a candle at her kitchen table, and sit in silence with a cup of jasmine tea before speaking a single word to anyone. I once asked her why she did it. She smiled and said, "I don't do it because I have to. I do it because it reminds me who I am." That is discipline, not performance, not pressure, but presence. Her ritual was not on Instagram. No one applauded her. But in those quiet moments, she met herself. And that, my friend, is the most sacred meeting of all. The myth of motivation. People often wait for motivation. They say, "I'll start walking when I feel inspired. I'll meditate when I'm less busy. I'll write when I'm in the mood." But motivation is like the wind. It comes and goes. Discipline, however, is the ground beneath your feet. It does not shift with your emotions. It remains. And the more you follow through on your own word, the more trust you build within yourself. That trust becomes confidence. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, steady kind that says, "I will not abandon myself." Let me ask you, what would your life look like if you showed up for yourself? Not just when it was easy, but when it was hardest. Would you still make that phone call? Would you still walk through that door? Would you still light that candle? If yes, then you have already begun the path. Not a performance. A practice Buddha never taught us to become extraordinary. He never said, "Become impressive." He said, "Do the small things and do them with full attention." That's it. Sweep the floor mindfully. Speak only what is true and kind. Wake up without pressing snooze. Fold your laundry with care. These tiny acts, done repeatedly with awareness, begin to shape your mind into something clear, calm, resilient. Discipline is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming present over and over again, even when you're tired, even when you're unsure, even when no one else is watching. Your turn to reflect. Now, let's return to you. What is one thing you do every day that aligns you with your deeper self? Is it a breath before you speak? A prayer before you sleep? A 5-minute silence before the world wakes? If you don't have one yet, create it now. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, and let it be simple. You don't need to impress anyone. You only need to be honest with yourself. Leave a trace of devotion. At the end of life, no one will remember how productive you were. They will remember how present you were, to yourself, to your breath, to the people you loved. That is the gift of discipline. It teaches you not to conquer time, but to honor it. To take each moment like a drop of water in your palm and say, "I will not waste this. I will not sleepwalk through this. I will meet it fully." Because that, dear one, is love. Not loud, not urgent, but faithful. Discipline is not control. It is remembering what matters and returning to it again and again. Chapter 4. Letting go is the beginning of strength. To hold, you must first release. That might sound like a paradox, but in truth, it is the very heart of spiritual wisdom. We spend so much of our lives accumulating. We collect experiences. We carry identities. We store away pain like boxes in the attic of the mind, too heavy to move, but too sacred to throw away. Especially as we grow older, we carry more than we realize. Regrets we never spoke aloud, griefs that never got their full goodbye, dreams we once loved but quietly buried. And yet, not everything we carry still belongs to us. The illusion of holding on. Let me ask you, what are you still holding that no longer supports the person you're becoming? Is it a memory that once gave you joy, but now only gives you ache? Is it a story about yourself that keeps you small? Is it a grudge disguised as righteousness? Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. Letting go means remembering, without grasping. It means honoring something for what it gave you, and then releasing it with love. Like a leaf falling in autumn. It does not hate the tree. It simply knows its time has come. The wooden bowl. An old monk once gave me a bowl. It was carved from teak wood, smooth and dark, with a rim that caught the light just so. I treasured it. Every morning I used it for my breakfast rice. Every evening I washed it with care. I would set it beside my mat as if it were a sacred object. One day I was carrying it from the well. My hand slipped, it fell to the ground, and it cracked. It was a small break, barely visible to others. But to me, it felt like a loss. I wept, not for the bowl, but for what it symbolized. The monk who had given it to me came and sat beside me in silence. Then he said something I've never forgotten. Now you understand. All things break, but not all things stop being beautiful. The crack did not ruin the bowl. It became part of its story. And that's what letting go is. It's not the erasure of what was. It's the acceptance that all things change, and in that change, something new is born. Letting go of old selves. There's something no one tells you about aging. You do not become someone new. You begin to shed who you're not. The older you get, the more layers fall away. Ego, appearances, achievements, status. And what remains? You, raw, real, bare, beautiful. But that shedding process can feel like dying, because in a way, it is. You are letting go of identities you wore like armor. You're letting go of what the world told you mattered, but never truly fed your soul. And here's the truth. Letting go is an act of great strength. It's easier to hold on. It's easier to keep clenching our fists around the familiar, even if it's hurting us. But strength, real, inner strength, is the hand that learns to open. The quiet weights we carry. Sometimes, what we hold on to isn't loud. It's quiet, subtle, a whispered belief that we're too old to change, a silent judgment of a friend who wronged us years ago, a persistent guilt over something we did and cannot undo. These things aren't always visible to the outside world, but inside, they sap our energy. They cloud our joy. So I ask you gently, what thought, what habit, what memory are you still carrying that is asking to be laid down? Not in shame, but in freedom. Letting go doesn't mean you failed. It means you've healed. When a flower lets go. In Japan, there's a custom called hanami, the viewing of cherry blossoms. Every spring, people gather beneath the blooming sakura trees to witness their brief, breathtaking beauty. But what's most revered is not when the blossoms open. It's when they fall. In Buddhist culture, that falling is sacred, because in letting go of its petals, the flower teaches us about impermanence, about the dignity in release, about the grace of completion. Can you let something in your life fall today, gracefully? Even if it's a version of yourself you once loved, even if it's a relationship that didn't grow with you, even if it's the idea that you need to be more before you can be at peace. Let go to begin. Again, let me tell you a story. There was a businessman who had built an empire. Wealth, power, admiration, he had it all. But he came to the monastery one day, exhausted. He said, "I don't know who I am anymore." I asked him, "What would happen if you stopped trying to be someone?" He looked at me like I was speaking another language. I said, "You've been building for decades. Maybe now it's time to unbuild, to let fall what no longer feels true." He didn't answer. But the next day, he swept the meditation hall, quietly, without needing to be anything but present. That was the beginning of his return. You see, letting go isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like sweeping the floor. A question for you. Right now, in this season of your life, what are you clinging to out of habit, not truth? Is it an old bitterness, a title, an outdated version of who you thought you'd be by now? I invite you to breathe into that space, to soften the grip, to whisper, "Thank you, you've served me. And now, I let you go." If this resonates with you, write in the comments, "I'm ready to release." You don't have to say what, just make the gesture. Let this be your first act of lightness, the strength in surrender. The world teaches us that strength is holding on. To stay strong means to endure, to grip, to fight. But in the Dharma, we learn something different. Strength is also surrender. Strength is also softness. Strength is choosing not to carry what no longer feeds your soul. There is a kind of power that comes not from control, but from clarity, from knowing what is yours and what is ready to be returned to the earth. Closing reflection. Letting go is not giving up. It is growing up. It is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is not the end of something meaningful. It is the beginning of something true. So I ask again, what are you still carrying that you no longer need to? What could your life feel like with a little more space? And what if you placed it down right now and walked forward, lighter? Because remember, all things break, but not all things stop being beautiful. Chapter 5. Failure is fertile soil. The flower only blooms after the soil breaks. There is something deeply human in our fear of failure. We try to avoid it. We hide it. We dress it up as something else. We call it a lesson, but deep down, many of us still carry the sting. But here in the monastery, we are taught to look at failure with different eyes. To us, failure is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that something new is trying to grow. Just as soil must break for the seed to rise, our self-image must crack for wisdom to emerge. Let me ask you, what's something you failed at recently? And did you treat that failure as an enemy or as a teacher? In the monastery, we compost our mistakes. We don't run from failure here. We don't hide it under perfection or excuse it with pride. We compost it. Just like the fallen leaves of autumn return to nourish the spring, our mistakes become material for growth. Shame turns to softness. Embarrassment turns to empathy. Ego begins to dissolve. And in that brokenness, something beautiful takes root. The novice who burned the tea. There was a novice monk. His name was Kiem. He was just 17. It was his first time leading the morning tea ceremony, a ritual that holds deep reverence in our practice. The room was silent. The candle was lit. The elders were seated, and in his nervousness, he boiled the water too long. The tea was bitter, undrinkable. When he realized what had happened, his hands began to shake. He bowed deeply and began to cry, not just from the mistake, but from the shame. Later that day, he came to me, afraid I would scold him, but I didn't. I looked at him and said, "Good, you failed. That means you've begun to learn." He looked confused at first. Then slowly, a tearful smile appeared on his face, and he bowed, not to me, but to the lesson, because in that moment, he had tasted humility, and humility is fertile ground. What if failure was a sign of progress? Think about a child learning to walk. We don't scream when they fall. We don't call it failure. We call it learning. But somewhere along the way, we forget that falling is how we grow. We come to believe that if we're not perfect, we're not worthy. That if we stumble, we're not enough. But that is the voice of the ego, not the voice of truth. The truth is this: if you're not failing, you're not stretching. And if you're not stretching, are you really living? Famous failures, silent growth. Let me share something you may not know. Steve Jobs was fired from the very company he created. He later said it was one of the best things that ever happened to him because it freed him to become a beginner again. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison before becoming the president of a free South Africa. He said, "I never lose. I either win or learn." Even the Buddha himself failed before he awakened. He tried asceticism to the extreme, nearly starving himself, before realizing that neither indulgence nor deprivation would lead to liberation. His path was forged through trial, error, and the courage to begin again. What makes these people different is not that they never failed, but that they saw their failure as soil. The stories we tell ourselves. So often, failure doesn't hurt because of what happened. It hurts because of the story we attach to it. I failed, therefore, I'm not enough. I failed, so I should stop trying. I failed, and that means everyone will see me differently. But none of that is truth. Those are judgments layered on top of a very natural human experience. Let me ask you, can you separate the event from the identity? Can you say, "I made a mistake," without saying, "I am a mistake"? This small shift can change your life. From fear to curiosity. In Buddhist practice, we are invited to move from fear into curiosity. Instead of asking, "What if I fail?" ask, "What might I learn?" What if failure wasn't the end of your story, but the beginning of a deeper chapter? What if the door you thought was closed forever was just inviting you to knock again, this time with humility? A story of rebirth after mistake. There was a woman who came to our temple in her 60s. Her name was Louise. She had once dreamed of being a poet, but gave it up to raise children, care for aging parents, and support a husband's career. When she finally had time to write again, she was afraid. "I'm too old to start," she said. "What if my writing is bad?" I told her. "Then let it be bad, but let it be yours." She began writing one poem a week. Most she never showed anyone. But a year later, she had a collection. When she finally read her poems aloud at a community gathering, her voice trembled, but her eyes shone. Afterward, she told me, "I thought failure would shame me, but it healed me, because I remembered who I was." You can begin again. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is part of it. You are allowed to fall. You are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to rewrite your story at any age. Buddhism teaches us that nothing is permanent. Not pain, not praise, not failure. And if nothing is permanent, then every failure is also temporary. So breathe. You haven't missed your chance. You're standing in it. A reflection for you. Think about one time in your life where you failed, truly, deeply. Then ask yourself, what did that experience teach me that success never could? Write it down. Better yet, share it in the comments. Let someone else feel less alone. Say simply, I failed and I grew. That sentence is enough to set another heart free. Closing wisdom. Failure is not the crack in your foundation. It is the crack that lets in water, and water, over time, softens the hardest stone. If you are breaking, you may just be softening. If you are stumbling, you may just be growing roots. Remember, the flower only blooms after the soil breaks, so don't be afraid to fall. Be afraid of never trying. And when you fall fully. Then rise, with wisdom in your hands and courage in your breath. Because every great journey begins again, on the ground. Chapter 6. Silence is stronger than argument. Speak only if your words are more beautiful than silence. There is a strength that doesn't shout. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't storm into a room or demand the final word. This kind of strength is quiet. It hums beneath the surface. It holds itself together when everything around it is falling apart. I have seen it in dying monks, whispering peace in their last breaths, in widowed grandmothers who sit on porches with soft eyes and stories in their bones, in children, yes, even children, with scars on their hearts, who still know how to smile. The world may call that gentleness, but I tell you, that is power. The noise of the ego. Much of what we call strength in the world is noise. The louder voice, the sharper comeback, the longer list of victories. But that is not the strength that endures. Because the ego is always trying to prove. And when it's busy proving, it cannot listen. And if it cannot listen, it cannot love. So I ask you, how much energy have you spent trying to be right when all your heart really wanted was to be understood? The nun who refused to hate. I once met a Tibetan nun named Tenzin. She had lived through things most of us could not imagine. She watched her family die. She was exiled from her homeland. She endured imprisonment and beatings. She had every reason, every right to be angry. Yet when I asked her what hurt the most, she did not say, losing my country or losing my freedom. She said, the fear that I might lose compassion. That is strength. To walk through hell and still protect your heart from closing. To be betrayed, but not become bitterness. To suffer injustice and still choose not to harden. Tenzin taught me that silence is not emptiness. It is protection. It is presence. It is knowing when words are not what's needed, you don't have to win. Let me offer you something radical. You don't need to win every argument. You don't even need to participate in every one. You don't need to be the loudest person in the room. You don't need to defend your every decision. You don't need to explain your heart to those committed to misunderstanding it. You only need to stay whole. And sometimes the most powerful way to stay whole is to say nothing at all. Silence is not surrender. Silence is choosing to preserve your peace over proving your point. A bowl that doesn't overflow. There's an old Zen story of a master and a scholar. The scholar came to learn about truth, but he talked nonstop about his own ideas, his studies, his beliefs. The master said nothing. He poured tea into the man's cup and kept pouring until it overflowed. The scholar shouted, "It's full! No more will fit." The master smiled. "Exactly. Your mind is like this cup. so full of your own ideas, nothing new can enter. Silence is the emptying of the cup. It is the space where wisdom enters. So I ask you, when was the last time you chose to listen instead of respond? To be present instead of persuasive? To hold space instead of holding power? The power of still words. In my years as a monk, I've learned that not all truth needs to be spoken. Not every insight needs an audience. Not every emotion needs a stage. There are things so sacred, so tender, that they live better in silence. I have seen two monks settle a disagreement without a single word, one bow, one breath, one shared smile, and peace returned. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to walk away in peace, or to say, "I understand," even when you don't agree, or to sit quietly beside someone who's hurting without trying to fix anything at all. When silence heals. There was a man who came to our monastery in the middle of a midlife unraveling. He had lost his business. His marriage was slipping. His confidence was shattered. He asked me, "What should I do next?" I said, "Come sit with me each morning, but don't speak." He was confused, but he came. Every day he sat in silence. Weeks passed. Then one morning, he opened his eyes and whispered, "The world is loud, but I'm learning to hear myself again." That was the day he began to heal. Because silence wasn't an absence, it was a return. When to speak, when to stay silent. This does not mean you should never speak. Words can heal. Words can liberate. But ask yourself first, is this spoken from ego or from essence? Will these words add clarity or just more noise? Am I speaking to connect or to control? The Buddha said, "Speak only if your words are more beautiful than silence. And if they're not, let the silence speak for you." A question for you. Think of the last time you argued. Did it make you feel stronger or smaller? Did it lead to understanding or just more distance? Now ask, what would have happened if I had chosen stillness instead? Share your thoughts in the comments. You can write, "I'm learning to choose peace." Let that be your quiet vow, and in doing so, perhaps you'll give others the courage to do the same. Closing reflection. The strongest person in the room is not always the one speaking. It's often the one holding the space for others to speak their truth. It's the one who stays grounded while tempers rise. It's the one who refuses to be baited, the one who chooses presence over performance. Strength is not volume, it's depth. And silence, true, anchored silence, has a depth no voice can touch. So the next time someone tries to pull you into their storm, choose to be the calm. The next time someone criticizes, misunderstands, or provokes you, ask yourself, what does my peace cost? And is this worth the price? Most of the time, the answer is no. You don't need to win the argument. You just need to stay whole. A question for you. Right now, this week, this season of your life, what could you commit to every day for the next 7 days? 1 sentence of writing? 10 mindful breaths before sleep? A walk at dawn? A journal entry? A glass of water with intention? Choose one thing. Keep it simple. Then come back. And tell us in the comments, "This is my practice." And let that public vow carry you. Let others witness your path. Let consistency become your offering. Closing reflection. You don't need to wait to feel inspired. You only need to remember why you began. Peace is not a lightning strike. It is a daily fire, tended gently, steadily. The strongest people I know are not the most passionate. They are the most faithful to their mornings, to their breath, to the simple, sacred act of returning, again and again. So the next time you wonder where your peace has gone, don't look outside. Look at your rhythm. Look at your vows. Look at the small, quiet acts you've neglected. Then begin again, because that is the true secret of peace, not force, not fire, but faithfulness. Faithfulness to your breath, to your promise, to your path. One step, one return, one ordinary, sacred day at a time. What if your life wasn't something to fix, but something to read, slowly, like scripture? What if the wrinkles, the stumbles, the silences were not mistakes, but verses? Dear one, if you've made it this far, pause for a moment. Breathe. Let the truth settle gently upon your chest. You already carry the seed of awakening, not someday, not after more effort. Now you don't need to be more. You don't need to fix what's not broken. You only need to return again and again to that quiet place within you where nothing is missing. The world may measure your worth in milestones, but the soul blooms quietly. And so I say to you, you are not too old to begin. You are not too late to change. You are not too lost to come home. You are not behind. You are becoming. Just as the moon returns each night, even if no one watches, just as the flower blooms again each spring, even if no one notices, so, too, does your spirit unfold, slowly, softly, silently, before you go. If something in this journey has stirred your heart, share it in the comments. You never know who might read your words and feel less alone. If this space gave you breath, like the video, as an offering of gratitude, and if you wish to walk this path with us, subscribe to Mindful Footsteps, not to follow me, but to follow you, the real you. And when the noise of the world returns, as it always will, you'll have a place to return to, a voice, a breath, a step. Because in the end, your life is not a mistake to hide. It is a sacred text, still being written, word by word, step by step, breath by breath. And you, dear listener, you are the author and the awakening.